In December 1943, in the ruins of an Italian town called Ortona, German paratroopers laughed out loud at the Canadian guns pointed at them. These were not ordinary German soldiers. These were Fallschirmjäger, the elite parachute troops of the 1st Parachute Division, the finest combat unit Hitler had in all of Italy. Their MG-42 machine guns fired 1,200 rounds every minute. The Canadian Bren guns fired just 500. On paper, the Germans had already won. 6 minutes later, every one of those laughing Germans was either dead or bleeding on the ground. And the Canadians had used only 64 bullets to do it. This is the story of how that happened. The sound of the MG-42 was like nothing else in the war. Allied soldiers called it Hitler's buzzsaw. It did not fire in bursts you could count. It fired so fast that the individual shots blended together into a single continuous ripping sound, like a giant hand tearing a bedsheet apart only 1,000 times louder. 1,200 rounds per minute meant 20 rounds per second. The human ear could not separate one shot from the next. It was just a long, terrible scream of metal. On the morning of December 22nd, 1943, 3 of those screaming guns had 47 Canadian soldiers pinned flat against the frozen rubble of what used to be a bakery. These men belonged to the Loyal Edmonton Regiment, one of the toughest infantry units in the Canadian Army Volunteers to a man. Just weeks earlier, this little shop on a narrow street in Ortona had been turning out panettone for Christmas. Now the ovens were smashed, the walls were cracked open to the sky, and the floor was covered in a layer of brick dust and broken glass that crunched underfoot like fresh snow. The MG-42s were firing from 3 directions. One was 85 meters to the left, set up behind a wall of sandbags stacked 5 high. Another was 95 meters straight ahead, positioned in a second-floor window of a building that had lost half its face to shell fire. The third was 120 meters to the right, tucked inside the skeleton of a small chapel whose roof had caved in, but whose stone walls still stood firm. The crossfire was perfect. 3 lines of fire overlapping in a 200-meter kill zone. Every time a Canadian soldier so much as shifted his weight, all 3 guns would open up at once. Bullets cracked and whined off the stone. Chips of brick sprayed into the air like red confetti. The smell of cordite hung thick in the cold morning air, that sharp metallic bite that gets into your nose and throat and stays there. 9 Canadian soldiers had been hit in the first 4 minutes. The medics could not reach them. The wounded men lay on the open street, some moaning, some silent, while bullets kicked up dirt and stone all around their bodies. Corporal James McLeod pressed his face into the frozen dirt and listened. He was 28 years old, lean and wiry, with the kind of quiet toughness you find in men who grew up in deep forests. His hands wrapped around the stock of his Bren gun were the hands of a man who had been handling firearms since he was 12 years old. His right index finger rested along the trigger guard. Not on the trigger. Not yet. And then he heard something that made his blood run cold. Over the roar of their own guns, the Germans were laughing. He could hear them clearly in the gaps between bursts. Shouting to each other in German, their voices carrying that particular tone that needs no translation. They were mocking something. They were making fun of the Canadian guns. They were laughing at the Bren. To understand why 47 men were lying in the rubble waiting to die, you need to understand what Ortona was. The Italian campaign had been grinding on since the Allies landed in Sicily in July 1943. Winston Churchill had called Italy the soft underbelly of Europe. He was catastrophically wrong. Under Field Marshal Kesselring, the Germans turned every mountain ridge, every river crossing, every stone farmhouse into a fortress. The Allies paid for every mile in blood. Canada's 1st Infantry Division, 26,000 strong, had landed in Sicily as part of the invasion force. Every man was a volunteer. They fought their way through Sicily, crossed the Strait of Messina onto the Italian mainland, and spent the autumn pushing north through mud and rain and mountains. By December, they were exhausted, under strength, and running low on everything except determination. Their objective was Ortona, a small port town on the Adriatic coast. Population 10,000 in peacetime, 3,000 years of history. The Canadians' commanding general, Major General Christopher Vokes, a famously hot-tempered officer who had once shouted at Field Marshal Montgomery himself, expected the Germans to pull back without a fight. The Germans had been doing that all the way up the Italian boot. Fall back, set up a new line, make the Allies bleed, fall back again. But Ortona was different. Adolf Hitler gave a direct order: hold Ortona at all costs. And the man he chose to carry out that order was General Lieutenant Richard Heydrich, commanding the 1st Parachute Division. The Fallschirmjäger, the most battle-hardened, ideologically fanatical, tactically skilled infantry unit in the entire German order of battle in Italy. General Alexander, the Allied Supreme Commander in the Mediterranean, called them simply the best German troops in Italy, starting on December 12th. 8 full days before the first Canadian soldier set foot in town, German engineers had been preparing Ortona for a siege. They demolished buildings to create clear fields of fire. They piled rubble across the narrow medieval streets to block tanks and funnel infantry into killing grounds. They planted mines inside houses, under staircases, beneath floor tiles, inside furniture. Every door that opened, every brick that shifted, could be the last thing a man ever touched. The press called it Little Stalingrad. Matthew Halton, the CBC war correspondent, broadcast from the ruins, and the whole world listened. The battle for a town that had no real strategic value became a matter of national pride for both sides. And somewhere in the middle of that inferno, Corporal James McLeod and his platoon walked into a perfect ambush. Before the war, McLeod had been a hunting guide in the deep forests of Nova Scotia. That part of Canada was settled by Scottish families in the 1700s. Clans like MacLeod, MacDonald, and Fraser had put down roots in those cold maritime forests and never left. For generations, they lived by the timber trade and by hunting, and James McLeod was the latest in a long line of men who knew the woods the way a sailor knows the sea. He grew up shooting his father's Lee Enfield rifle, the same .303 British cartridge that the Bren gun fired. By 14, he was guiding wealthy men from Halifax and Toronto into the backcountry to hunt white-tailed deer and black bear. Those city hunters always wanted to shoot as much as possible. They thought more bullets meant more kills. They would blaze away at a deer from 50 yards miss with the first shot, and then empty their magazines into the trees while the animal disappeared. McLeod learned early that the hunters who went home with meat were not the ones who fired the most. They were the ones who fired the least. One shot, carefully aimed, breath controlled, trigger squeezed gently, not jerked, and the animal went down clean. His father had told him a thing McLeod never forgot. If you miss the first shot, the deer hears it and runs. It is gone. You do not get a second one. That lesson followed McLeod across the Atlantic Ocean to a training camp in England, where he put on a demonstration that stunned his entire battalion. 20 targets at 100 meters, 20 shots, 20 hits. Dead center every one. The other soldiers thought it was luck. Lieutenant David Drummond, who watched closely, saw something different. He saw the way McLeod controlled his breathing, the way he squeezed the trigger like he was petting a cat, the way he adjusted for wind that other men could not even feel. This was not luck. This was a lifetime of skill. And now that skill was lying face down in the rubble of an Italian bakery, listening to Germans laugh. Lieutenant Drummond crawled up beside McLeod. His face was caked in brick dust, and his steel helmet had a fresh groove across the top where a bullet had passed close enough to part his hair. He pressed his mouth close to McLeod's ear to be heard over the guns. We need to pull back. We cannot win a firefight against those MG-42s. They are putting out too much fire. That is what command always says. More bullets win the fight. McLeod shook his head. Just give me 10 minutes. Drummond looked at him, the way you look at a man who has lost his mind. 10 minutes was a lifetime when you were pinned under machine gun fire. In the time it had taken Drummond to crawl over to McLeod, 2 more men had been hit. 11 men down now, and the number was climbing. On the radio, Captain William Sinclair was demanding an immediate withdrawal. Sinclair was a by-the-book officer. The manual said retreat when outgunned. Sinclair would retreat. No improvisation, no deviation from doctrine. Sinclair says you are going to get more men killed with this crazy hunting guide nonsense, Drummond said. McLeod did not blink. Sir, you saw me shoot in training. You know what the Bren can do when you aim it properly. A silence fell between the 2 men that had nothing to do with the guns. Drummond was an officer. McLeod was a corporal. The chain of command was clear. But Drummond had seen McLeod shoot. He had seen that demonstration in England, 20 for 20. And he had seen the way this man moved through the Italian countryside, like he was back in his own forest reading the terrain the way other men read newspapers. You have got your 10 minutes, Drummond said. But if this goes wrong, it is both our necks. McLeod nodded and crawled over to where the other Bren gun teams were sheltering behind a collapsed wall. The Bren light machine gun was born from a partnership between the Brno Arms factory in Czechoslovakia and the Enfield factory in England. BR no plus EN field equals Bren. It weighed just under 9 kilograms. Light enough for one man to carry at a run, heavy enough to stay steady when firing. The barrel was 25 inches long, and it could hit a target accurately at 600 yards. That is more than 5 football fields. But the Bren had a feature that made it look strange. The magazine sat on top of the gun instead of underneath, a curved box holding 30 rounds sticking up like a fin. A lot of soldiers did not like the design. It caught on door frames and snagged on rubble, and the Bren fired 500 rounds per minute, not even half the rate of the MG-42. The John Inglis factory in Toronto had produced over 200,000 Bren guns during the war. Every single one left the factory with the same specifications: 500 rounds per minute, 30-round magazine, chambered in .303 British. On paper, the MG-42 was superior in every category that seemed to matter: rate of fire, caliber, ammunition capacity, sustained fire capability. On paper, the Bren was a joke, and that is exactly why the Germans were laughing. But paper does not shoot back. McLeod positioned himself behind his Bren and began to watch. Not to shoot, to watch. He studied the 3 German positions the way he had once studied animals in the forest. Back home in Nova Scotia, before you could hunt a thing, you had to understand it. You had to know its patterns, its rhythms, the moments when it felt safe and let its guard down. Even the most dangerous predator has a pattern. Even the black bear, the most lethal animal in the Nova Scotian woods, moves with a predictable rhythm when it believes it is alone. The MG-42 on the left fired for 8 seconds, then went silent for 4, while the crew fed a new belt of ammunition. The one in the center fired for 6 seconds, then paused for 5. The one on the right fired for 7, stopped for 3. The Germans were good, disciplined, professional, but they were following patterns. And James McLeod had spent his whole life reading patterns. He turned to the other Bren gunners. Private Tommy Mackey was 19 years old from a fishing village on the Nova Scotia coast. His face was white under the dust. This was his first real battle. Beside him, Private Robert Foran, 24, a coal miner's son from Cape Breton. Foran's hands were steady. Years of swinging a pickaxe in the dark tunnels under the earth had given him a grip that no amount of military training could replicate. "They think their speed beats our aim," McLeod said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They think 1,200 rounds beats 500, but they are wrong about something important. They are measuring the wrong thing." The other gunners leaned closer to hear. Bullets were still tearing up the wall above their heads, spraying them with dust and grit, but they needed to hear the plan. Every one of their 1,200 bullets sprays all over the place. Maybe 1 in 20 hits anything at all. But our guns are different. The Bren can put a bullet exactly where you want it, every single time. He looked at each man. "So, here is what we are going to do. We are not going to spray and pray. We are going to wait. We are going to aim. And we are going to fire 3 to 5 rounds at a time, aimed at their gunners. Time to hit during the reload when they cannot shoot back." Foran shook his head. "Corporal, with respect, that is not going to be enough fire. We need to keep shooting to keep their heads down. That is what they taught us. Suppressive fire." McLeod understood this concern. Every soldier in the Canadian Army had been trained the same way. When you are in a firefight, you lay down as much fire as you can. You bury the enemy under bullets. But that doctrine was written for open fields and long-range battles. This was close-quarters street fighting where every single round counted. In the woods back home, McLeod said, if you miss a deer with your first shot, you do not get a second one. The deer hears the shot and it runs. It is gone. These German gunners are the same. If we spray bullets everywhere, they just keep their heads down and keep firing. But if we wait, aim, and drop their gunners one by one, the whole position falls apart. He spread the 3 Bren teams in a staggered line behind the broken wall, each 10 meters apart. This was not how the manual said to do it. Standard doctrine called for concentration of firepower. But McLeod was not thinking like a soldier. He was thinking like a hunter. Spread out so one burst could not kill them all. Give each team a clear shot at a different position. He assigned the targets. Tommy Mackey, left position, 85 meters. That gun fires for 8 seconds and reloads for 4. You shoot during those 4 seconds. Robert Foran, center position, 95 meters. 6 seconds of fire, 5 seconds of silence. That 5-second window is yours. McLeod took the hardest target himself. Right position, 120 meters. 7 seconds of fire, only 3 seconds to reload. The shortest window, the longest range. We wait for the reload. Aim at the gunner first. If you cannot see him clearly, aim at the muzzle flash. That is where he is. 3 to 5 rounds, no more. Then wait for the next reload. Tommy Mackey swallowed hard. What if it does not work? McLeod pressed his cheek against the stock of his Bren gun. He looked down the sight at the German position on the right. Then the lieutenant calls in artillery, and we get out of here. But I think it is going to work. I think those Germans are about to learn something about Canadian guns. He set out his magazines in a neat row on the frozen ground beside him. Mackey and Foran did the same. More than enough ammunition between the 3 guns, though McLeod did not expect to need much. The Bren was not about volume. It never had been. 36 Canadian soldiers were watching. Some with hope, most with fear. 11 of their comrades were down, and the fate of every man on that street now rested on a corporal with an idea he had learned from hunting deer. Above them, red and green Christmas ribbons that Italian families had hung before the war still dangled from the shattered window frames. They swayed in the December wind, small bright scraps of a normal life that no longer existed. McLeod clicked off the safety. He placed his finger along the trigger guard. Not on the trigger, not yet. His heartbeat was steady. Not too fast. Good. His hands were not shaking. Also good. In his mind, images stacked on top of each other like playing cards. Sicily, 5 months ago, where he had killed a man for the first time. An Italian soldier barely old enough to shave who looked at him through the brush with wide, frightened eyes. McLeod had fired before he could think. One shot. Instinct. The boy fell. There had been a photograph of a family in his breast pocket. McLeod had not slept for 3 nights after that. Then the crossing of the Moro River in early December, where the Princess Patricias went over in darkness, and the Seaforth Highlanders fought their way to a bridgehead under fire while engineers built a floating bridge through the night. Then, the gully that long ravine south of Ortona, where the Germans had dug in and slaughtered wave after wave of attacking Canadians. The West Nova Scotia Regiment men from McLeod's own province had been chewed to pieces there. They lost 18 officers, including their commanding officer. A war correspondent described them as a rugged maritime brotherhood of fishermen, miners, farmers, and apple growers. McLeod knew many of those men. They came from towns and villages he had walked through. Some had been his clients before the war, men who paid him to guide them through forests that now seemed to exist on another planet entirely. Captain Paul Triquet of the Royal 22nd Regiment had earned the Victoria Cross at Casa Berardi with just 15 men and 4 tanks holding a crossroads against everything the Germans could throw at them. The cost of taking that single farmhouse was measured in hundreds of Canadian lives. By the time the Canadians entered Ortona on December 20th, they were exhausted. Many rifle companies were down to 30 men. They were facing German paratroopers who were rested, well-fed, well-supplied, and who had spent 8 days turning the town into a fortress. That was the situation on the morning of December 22nd, when McLeod and his platoon turned a corner and walked into 3 MG-42s. Every road in his life had led to this corner. Every deer he had tracked, every shot he had placed, every pattern he had learned to read in the forests of Nova Scotia. The MG-42 on the right stopped firing. McLeod counted. 1, 2, 3. His finger moved to the trigger. Through the Bren's iron sights, he could see the German gunner bent over his weapon, feeding a new belt of ammunition. The man's head and shoulders rose above the sandbags. 120 meters, clear as daylight. McLeod squeezed the trigger. The Bren spoke, not the way the MG-42 spoke. The MG-42 screamed. It filled the air with so many bullets so fast that the noise became a single unbroken shriek of tearing metal. The MG-42 was volume. The MG-42 was fury. The MG-42 was a wall of lead thrown at the world with no particular care for where it landed. The Bren did not scream. The Bren said 3 words. Tack, tack, tack. 3 rounds. Measured. Deliberate. Each one placed exactly where James McLeod wanted it to go. The first round struck the sandbag 6 inches in front of the German gunner. The second caught him in the left shoulder and spun him sideways. The third hit him square in the chest, and he fell backward out of sight behind the wall of sandbags, his hands leaving the MG-42 the way a man's hands leave a table when his chair tips over. There one moment, gone the next. A second German soldier scrambled to take his place. He had been feeding ammunition belts from the right side of the gun. Now he threw himself behind the weapon and grabbed the handles and tried to swing the barrel toward the Canadians. McLeod was already aimed at that exact spot. He had been waiting for exactly this. 3 more rounds. The second man fell across the first. 90 meters to the left, Tommy Mackey opened fire. Tack, 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 tack. 4 rounds. A pause so brief it barely existed. Then tack, tack, tack. 3 more. The 19-year-old fisherman's son from Nova Scotia was doing exactly what McLeod had told him to do. Wait for the reload. Count the silence. Aim at the gunner. Fire short. The hands that had spent years hauling nets and turning winches on the cold Atlantic held the Bren gun with a steadiness that surprised even McLeod. There was no panic in those hands. There was no hesitation. Tommy Mackey was scared half to death, but his fingers did what they had been trained to do, and the rounds went where they were pointed. The MG-42 on the left went silent. In the center, Robert Foran fired 5 rounds, paused, fired 4 more. The coal miner from Cape Breton handled the Bren the way he handled a drill underground. Smooth motions. No wasted energy. His body was a machine built for repetitive precision, and it did not matter whether the task was boring through rock or boring through a German gun position at 95 meters. Foran did not flinch. He did not hurry. He placed his rounds the way a bricklayer places bricks, one at a time, exactly where they needed to go. The MG-42 on the right tried to come back to life. A third German soldier threw himself behind the weapon. He never got his hands on the grips. McLeod had been watching that position through his sights for the last 4 seconds, finger on the trigger, waiting. 3 rounds. The gun went silent again. This time, nobody else came forward to take it over. The surviving Germans at that position were flat on their bellies behind the sandbags, and they were not moving. They understood now. Somebody on the other side of this street could see them. Somebody on the other side could hit them. And that somebody was not missing. 90 seconds had passed since McLeod's first shot. He had fired 23 rounds. Mackey had fired 21. Foran had fired 20. 64 rounds total from 3 Bren guns. 2 of the 3 German positions were completely silent. No movement, no sound, no laughter. The third position, the one in the center, was still active. But the shooting had changed. Where the MG-42 had been sweeping the street with controlled methodical fire just 2 minutes ago. Now the gun was jerking and bouncing, the rounds going high, smacking into the upper stories of the buildings behind the Canadian positions. The gunner was panicking. McLeod could see it in the way the weapon moved. Short, choppy, desperate motions. The kind of movement you see in an animal that has suddenly realized it is not the predator. McLeod had seen this before. In the deep forests of Nova Scotia, when a black bear turns a corner and finds itself face to face with something it did not expect. There is a moment when the bear's whole body language changes. The shoulders hunch. The head drops. The eyes go wide. It stops being a hunter and starts being prey. Everything that made it dangerous collapses at once. Not because its claws have gotten smaller, not because its teeth have dulled, but because its mind has broken. The German gunner in the center position was a man whose mind was breaking. He was firing at nothing. He was wasting ammunition. He was making noise to make himself feel like he was still in the fight. But McLeod knew, and the German probably knew too, that it was already over. 6 minutes after McLeod's first shot, the last MG-42 fell silent. The quiet that followed was almost louder than the guns. It arrived all at once, the way dawn arrives, filling up the spaces between the ruined buildings and the rubble and the bodies and the frost. 47 Canadian soldiers lay in the wreckage, and for the first time in 10 minutes, they could hear themselves breathe. They could hear the wind moving through the empty window frames. They could hear the faint clicking of those Christmas ribbons, red and green, tapping against the broken glass. Lieutenant Drummond looked at his watch. He looked at the 3 German positions. He looked at McLeod. At the rate they had been taking casualties in the first 4 minutes, a 9-man hit, in 4 minutes, the entire platoon would have been wiped out in less than 20 minutes. But McLeod and 2 other Bren gunners had ended it in 6. 64 rounds. 3 machine gun positions silenced. The medics were already running. 2 of them sprinted out from behind the wall toward the wounded men lying in the street. Their Red Cross armbands bright against the gray rubble. Other soldiers moved forward carefully, rifles up toward the German positions. They found 15 Fallschirmjäger dead or critically wounded. Most were gunners and ammunition handlers. The men who sat behind the weapons. The men who fed the belts. McLeod's plan had targeted them first, and it had worked exactly the way he said it would. These were Fallschirmjäger, Hitler's finest. the most battle-hardened paratroopers in Italy, and they had been taken apart by 3 guns they had laughed at just minutes earlier. No more laughing, no more firing, just quiet. Tommy Mackey's hands were trembling as he detached the magazine from his Bren. The trembling had not been there while he was shooting. It arrived now after the shooting was over, the way a fever arrives after the wound. "I cannot believe that worked, Corporal. I thought for sure we were all going to die on this street." McLeod put his hand on the young man's shoulder. "You aimed. That is what made the difference. You did not panic and spray bullets everywhere. You aimed." But Mackey's eyes were not looking at McLeod. They were looking past him down the street toward the German positions where the men he had shot were lying. Some of them were still moving. The soft sounds they made carried in the new silence. These were not cod or mackerel thrashing in a net. These were men, young men, men with mothers and fathers and perhaps wives and children in some town in Germany that Mackey would never see. Tommy Mackey had killed people. He was 19 years old and he had killed people, and that fact was settling into him the way cold water settles into a boat slowly from the bottom up, filling every space. McLeod recognized the look. He had worn it himself in Sicily 5 months ago, staring into a shaving mirror and seeing someone he did not quite recognize staring back. It was the look of a man who has just discovered that he is capable of ending a life and who will spend the rest of his own life knowing it. Robert Foran reacted differently. The miner from Cape Breton removed his magazine and inspected his Bren with mechanical precision, the way he would have checked safety equipment at the start of a shift underground. His face showed nothing. His hands were steady, but when he caught McLeod's eye, something passed between them that neither man would ever put into words. Foran had argued against the plan. He had said it would not work. He had said they needed suppressive fire. He had been wrong, and he was alive because he had been wrong. And the weight of that simple fact was a thing that coal miners from Cape Breton did not speak about, but carried with them always. Drummond crawled over. His face was still caked with dust, but there was something new on it now. A smile. Exhausted, shaky, barely holding together. But a smile. "McLeod, I owe you an apology. I should have trusted you from the start." "You did trust me, sir. You gave me 10 minutes. I almost did not, but you did. That is what matters." There was a silence between them that had nothing to do with the guns. In that moment, the line between officer and corporal, between the man who gave orders and the man who received them, dissolved completely. They were just 2 men who had nearly died together and were still breathing. "Do not tell Sinclair I trusted a hunting guide over his beloved manual." "Too late, sir. Sinclair is probably already rewriting the manual." They both laughed. A tired, thin, shaking kind of laugh. The laugh of men who are still alive and cannot quite believe it. It sounded nothing like the German laughter that had filled this street 6 minutes ago. The battle for Ortona did not end with McLeod's ambush. It had barely begun. Over the next 6 days, the fighting grew worse in ways that none of the Canadians had imagined possible. The town became a labyrinth of death. Every building was a fortress. Every doorway was a potential grave. The Germans had turned Ortona into the kind of battlefield that existed in nightmares, where the enemy could be above you, beside you, beneath you, behind a wall you were leaning against. The Canadians adapted. They developed a technique that soldiers would study for decades afterward. They called it mouseholing. Instead of going out into the streets where the MG-42s would cut them down, they blasted through the shared walls between buildings. They took Hawkins grenades, the small anti-tank mines, and lashed them to wooden poles with tape and primacord. 4 or 5 charges detonated at once could blow a hole through a stone wall big enough for a man to climb through. And so the Canadians moved through the town like ghosts passing from building to building without ever stepping outside. Room by room, wall by wall, floor by floor. On December 26, the day after Christmas, the Germans lured a platoon of 24 Canadian soldiers into a building. Then they demolished the entire structure. 23 men were killed instantly. One survived buried alive under the rubble for 3 days before his comrades dug him out. The Canadians retaliated by wiring a building full of German paratroopers and blowing it to dust, 40 to 50 men inside. This was the nature of Little Stalingrad. This was the war that Matthew Halton broadcast to the world. And in the middle of that horror, word of what McLeod had done on December 22nd spread through the Canadian ranks like fire through dry grass. That evening, officers from other companies came looking for McLeod. They wanted details. How had he set up the Bren teams? How had he timed the shots? How had 3 slow guns beaten 3 fast ones? McLeod explained it the way he would have explained tracking a deer. Patiently. Simply. without any military jargon. Watch the target. Learn its pattern. Wait for the vulnerable moment. Shoot when it cannot shoot back. Do not try to match its firepower. Match its weakness. Captain William Sinclair came to see McLeod personally. The by-the-book officer who had ordered the retreat, who had called McLeod's plan crazy hunting guide nonsense, stood in front of the corporal and said 5 words. Good work today. Unconventional, but good. Then Sinclair did something that surprised everyone. He ordered every Bren gunner in the entire battalion to attend a briefing led by Corporal McLeod, a corporal teaching officers and NCOs how to fight. It was not how the Army worked. But Sinclair had watched 11 men go down on that street and then watched 3 Bren guns put a stop to it with 64 bullets, and the manual suddenly seemed like a document written by men who had never heard an MG-42 fire. December 25th, 1943. Christmas Day. 3 days had passed since the ambush. 3 days of continuous fighting, of mouse-holing through walls of booby traps and snipers, and the constant metallic rattle of gunfire echoing off stone. 3 days in which the Canadians had pushed deeper into Ortona, one shattered building at a time, and the Germans had contested every room and every staircase and every pile of rubble as if the fate of the war depended on it. A few blocks from the front lines inside the battered church of Santa Maria di Constantinople, the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada sat down to eat. They came in shifts. One group would eat while the others fought. Then they would swap. The menu was extraordinary for a war zone. Soup, roast pork with applesauce, cauliflower and mixed vegetables, mashed potatoes with gravy, Christmas pudding and mince pie for dessert, a couple of bottles of beer per man. The signals officer played the church organ. The padre had organized an impromptu choir. Christmas carols rang out through the church while shell fire boomed outside and small arms fire crackled a few streets away. The men sat at tables set with white cloths and ate with knives and forks, and for a brief strange hour they were human beings again. Not soldiers, not killers, not targets. Just young men eating pork and singing carols in a bombed-out church in Italy while the world burned around them. Then they put down their forks and picked up their rifles and walked back to the war. The loyal Edmonton Regiment was not so fortunate. They were still on the front line, still fighting, still dying. Their Christmas dinner was delivered to them in the rubble. A cold pork chop and a bottle of beer. That was it. No white tablecloths, no organ music, no carols, just a piece of cold meat and a warm beer in a freezing ruin. McLeod sat in the ruins and ate his cold pork and thought about Nova Scotia, about the pine forests under snow, about the silence of the woods on Christmas morning, about the smell of wood smoke and his mother's cooking, and the particular quality of light that comes through frosted window panes in a small house in the Maritime Provinces. All of it felt impossibly far away, as if it had happened to a different man in a different lifetime. Tommy Mackey sat beside him, eating his own cold portion. He did not speak. Since the ambush 3 days ago, Mackey had become quieter. His eyes, which had been wide and young and frightened on December 22nd, had aged. Something behind them had changed in a way that cold pork and warm beer could not change back. Across the lines, the German paratroopers had their own Christmas. A small tree, sausage and cake that comrades had risked their lives to bring forward. Their commander noted in his diary that there was no place for Christmas sentiments in Ortona. We do not know how long we can hold on. He was right to worry. By nightfall on December 27th, the Fallschirmjäger had nothing left. They had fought for 8 straight days against an enemy that would not stop coming, that blasted through walls instead of walking through doors, that had somehow learned to use its slow guns in a way that made the fast guns useless. That night, what remained of the German garrison slipped out of Ortona under cover of darkness. By morning, the Canadians walked through silent streets. The battle was over. The cost had been staggering. During the whole of bloody December, from the Morrill River crossings through the fall of Ortona, the 1st Canadian Infantry Division suffered 2,339 casualties, 484 men killed. These were volunteers, every one of them men who had raised their hands and said they would go. And nearly 500 of them never came home. But something else came out of Ortona besides grief. In the weeks that followed, Canadian infantry units across the Italian front began to adopt McLeod's precision fire tactics. They stopped trying to match the MG-42 bullet for bullet. They stopped pouring ammunition downrange in the hope that enough of it would hit something. Instead, they waited. They aimed. They fired short bursts of 3 to 5 rounds. They targeted the gunners during the reload. The results were striking. Canadian casualties from machine gun fire dropped by more than a third. Units that had been losing firefight after firefight against MG-42 positions suddenly began winning them. Not because they had better weapons, not because they had more men, because they were using what they had in a fundamentally different way. The Germans noticed. They adjusted their tactics. They built deeper bunkers with overhead cover. They placed multiple MG-42s in each position, reasoning that if the Canadians could take out one gun, they might not be able to take out 3 at once. They increased their engagement distances beyond 200 meters, where they believed the Bren could not be accurate enough to hit individual gunners. But every countermeasure ran into the same problem, the Italian winter. The MG-42 fired so fast that it overheated constantly, even in cold weather. When a red-hot barrel met cold rain, it warped. The gun jammed more frequently. Changing barrels in the mud and freezing cold was an ordeal. Fingers went numb. Fine motor skills vanished. Every second a crew spent fumbling with a hot barrel change was a second they could not return fire. The Bren had none of these problems. It fired slowly enough that the barrel stayed cool. Its mechanism was simpler with fewer parts that could foul or freeze. And that top-mounted magazine, the one that every soldier had complained about, the one that snagged on doorways and caught on rubble, turned out to be a genuine advantage in the tight spaces of urban combat. When a soldier needed to fire around a corner or over a low wall, he kept the gun low and the magazine stuck up where his hand could reach it. Changing a magazine took seconds. The German guns fed from the side or the bottom, and in cramped spaces reloading was a nightmare. The feature that everyone had mocked became the feature that saved lives. By February 1945, 186 separate Canadian infantry sections had filed official reports documenting successful engagements using aimed precision fire from Bren guns. 186 individual firefights where the Canadians were outgunned on paper and won anyway because they aimed better and thought smarter. British units in Northwest Europe heard about the Canadian results and adopted the same approach. By early 1945, British reports showed that units employing Bren precision tactics suffered 40% fewer casualties than units using the old suppressive fire doctrine. 40%. That number is not an abstraction. 40% fewer casualties means hundreds of men who went home to their families instead of being buried in foreign fields. Hundreds of fathers who watched their children grow up. Hundreds of sons who came back to their mothers. Because a hunting guide from Nova Scotia looked at a machine gun and saw an animal with a pattern, and he waited for the vulnerable moment, and he did not miss. Every new replacement who arrived at the front and was handed a Bren gun heard the story. The veterans told it the way veterans tell every important story, which is to say they told it simply and without much embellishment because the facts did not need any. The Germans laughed at our gun. A corporal from Nova Scotia told us to aim instead of spray. We aimed. The Germans stopped laughing. That was about the size of it. MacLeod never sought credit. He never asked for recognition. He did his job and he taught others to do theirs. And when the fighting moved on, he moved with it carrying his Bren and his quiet certainty that one aimed round was worth 100 wild ones. The war moved on, and the men who survived Ortona moved with it. In early 1945, more than a year after those 6 minutes on a frozen street, the Canadian forces in Italy were pulled out and transferred to Northwest Europe. It was called Operation Goldflake, though nobody at the time used that name. To the soldiers, it was simpler than that. They were leaving Italy. They were going to fight somewhere else. The mud would be different. The rain would be the same. The 1st Canadian Corps was reunited with the 2nd Canadian Corps under the banner of the 1st Canadian Army, commanded by General Harry Crerar. It was the first time in history that 2 full Canadian Corps had served together under a single Canadian general. The largest fighting force any Canadian commander had ever led. Their mission was the liberation of the Netherlands. The Dutch had endured nearly 5 years of German occupation. During the winter of 1944 to 1945, the occupation reached its most brutal phase. The Germans cut off food and fuel supplies to the western provinces in retaliation for a Dutch railway strike that had supported the Allied advance. What followed was the Hunger Winter. The Hunger Winter. An estimated 20,000 Dutch civilians starved to death in one of the richest agricultural regions of Northern Europe. Mothers boiled tulip bulbs into a bitter paste and fed it to their children. Families stripped the bark from trees and ground it into flour. Old men collapsed on the streets of Amsterdam and The Hague, too weak to walk home, too hungry to care. Into this landscape of starvation and despair came the Canadians. Men who had survived the worst fighting in Italy and who carried the scars of Ortona in their bodies and in their minds. Among them was James McLeod, now promoted, carrying his Bren gun on a new front. Beside him, as always, Tommy Mackey and Robert Foran, the three men who had silenced 3 MG-42s with 64 rounds on a December morning that already felt as though it belonged to another century. They carried the Bren, and they carried the lesson. Every bullet must have a name on it. McLeod taught the new replacements the same way he had taught Mackey and Foran, patiently, quietly, with the unhurried calm of a man who had tested his ideas under the worst conditions imaginable and who knew in his bones that they worked. The replacements were young. So young that McLeod sometimes felt less like a corporal and more like an old man talking to boys. Many of them had never heard a shot fired in anger. They held their Bren guns the way children hold new bicycles, with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty and fear. McLeod would sit beside them and say the same things he had said in the rubble of Ortona. Watch the target, find the pattern, wait for the reload. Aim at the gunner, 3 to 5 rounds. No more. The boys would nod and try to look confident, and McLeod would think about Tommy Mackey at 19, white-faced and shaking, and wonder how many of these new boys would still be alive next month. March 1945. The Netherlands. 2 months before the end of the war in Europe. It was a rainy morning. The kind of rain that does not fall hard, but does not stop either. A steady, colorless drizzle that soaked through wool and leather and turned the Dutch roads into rivers of gray mud. The sky and the ground were the same shade of pewter, and the horizon dissolved into a formless blur where earth and cloud became indistinguishable. McLeod sat under a canvas tarp stretched between 2 trees at the edge of a flooded field, running a cleaning cloth through the barrel of his Bren. He had done this 10,000 times. His hands knew every contour of the weapon the way a violinist's hands know the neck of the instrument. He did not need to look at what he was doing. The motions were automatic. Cloth in, cloth out. Check the gas regulator. Wipe down the bolt. Inspect the magazine catch. A runner came through the mud. A young soldier, barely 20, with rainwater streaming down his face, and a look in his eyes that McLeod recognized before the boy opened his mouth. McLeod had seen that look before, on the faces of men who had to deliver news that no one wanted to hear. Lieutenant Drummond, booby trap. He is gone. 6 words. Each one landing like a small stone dropped into still water. McLeod heard them and understood them and did not move. He continued cleaning his Bren. The cloth went into the barrel and came out and went back in. His hands, the hands that had never trembled while firing, that had held steady through the ambush at Ortona and through months of fighting across Italy and Holland, began to shake. A fine tremor that started in his fingertips and worked its way into his wrists. David Drummond, the officer who had given McLeod 10 minutes when everyone else wanted to retreat. The man who had looked at a hunting guide corporal and seen something worth trusting. The man who had crawled through machine gun fire to say, "You have got your 10 minutes, but if this goes wrong, it is both our necks." Drummond would never go home. He would never sit in a chair by a fire and tell his grandchildren about the day a corporal from Nova Scotia broke an ambush with 64 bullets. He would never know that his decision to trust instinct over doctrine had rippled outward through 2 armies and changed the way soldiers used light machine guns for the next 50 years. He would never know any of that because he stepped on the wrong patch of mud on a road in Holland in March 1945, 2 months before the whole thing ended. War does not kill men in ways that make sense. It does not choose the wicked or the cowardly. It chooses at random with the blind mechanical cruelty of a mine buried in the road, and the men it takes are often the ones the world needed most. The officers who knew when to listen. The leaders who trusted the quiet man with the unconventional idea. The men who understood that being right matters less than being willing to let someone else be right. Drummond was all of those things, and now he was nothing. Just a name on a casualty report. Just an empty chair at an officer's mess that would be filled by morning. Tommy Mackey heard the news and wept. He did not try to hide it. In war, everyone cries. Those who say they do not are lying, or they have gone so far past feeling that there is nothing left to cry with. Mackey still had something left. He wept for Drummond openly and without shame, and McLeod sat beside him and said nothing because there was nothing to say. May 5, 1945. the town of Wageningen in the Netherlands. General Charles Foulkes of the 1st Canadian Corps accepted the surrender of all German forces in the Netherlands. 3 days later, May 8th, VE Day. The war in Europe was over. MacLeod stood in a long line of Canadian soldiers and watched the Germans come forward to lay down their weapons. They came in gray columns, thousands of them shuffling through the mud, and they placed their rifles and machine guns and pistols on the ground in growing piles, and then stood with empty hands. They looked exhausted, diminished, more human than MacLeod had expected. Just men, beaten, filthy, hollowed-out men who wanted to stop. Somewhere in those columns there might have been Fallschirmjäger who had defended Ortona. There might have been men who had laughed at the Bren. MacLeod searched their faces and tried to feel something appropriate. Victory, vindication, pride. What he felt was emptiness. 3 years and 4 months since leaving Nova Scotia. From the forests of home to the beaches of Sicily. From the rubble of Ortona to the flatlands of Holland. He had killed men. He had lost friends. He had watched boys become old men in a week. Now it was finished, and the loudest thing inside him was silence. The Dutch people flooded the streets. They pressed tulips into the soldiers' hands and kissed their cheeks, and wept with a gratitude so fierce it was almost violent. A popular song of the time went, "Trees heeft in Canadies." Trees has got herself a Canadian. The Dutch would never forget what the Canadians had done. Every spring for the rest of time, the Netherlands would send thousands of tulip bulbs to Ottawa, a living thank you note written in flowers that bloom and die and bloom again. MacLeod accepted the flowers. He smiled when he was meant to smile, but behind his eyes he was somewhere else. He was in a ruined bakery counting to 3. He was watching Christmas ribbons sway on a broken window. He was sitting beside Tommy Mackey in the rain saying nothing because the only man who could have said the right thing was lying under a white cross in Holland. The troop ship crossed the Atlantic in late summer. The deck was crowded with thousands of Canadian soldiers going home, and at night when the stars came out over the open ocean, and the only sounds were the engine and the waves against the hull. The men talked. They told each other things they would never tell their wives or mothers or children. They spoke about the men they had killed and the friends they had buried and the sounds that would follow them forever. These were conversations that belonged to the darkness and the sea, to the space between the war and whatever waited on the other side. The Canadian government awarded MacLeod the military medal for his actions at Ortona. The citation described how a corporal had broken a German ambush, destroyed 3 machine gun positions, and saved his platoon using precision fire tactics with the Bren gun. It was a serious decoration for serious courage. MacLeod did not hang the medal on his wall. He put it in a drawer in his bedroom and closed the drawer and did not open it again for years. When people asked about the war, he spoke about other men. About Tommy Mackey, the boy who could not stop shaking after his first kill, but who had ended the war as a sergeant. About Robert Foran, the miner who had argued against the plan and then executed it without a flaw. And always about Drummond. Drummond was the most important man in the whole story. He was not the best shot. He was not the one who came up with the plan. But he was the one who believed. And that is the hardest thing there is in war or anywhere else. Believing in something no one has tried before. MacLeod went home to Nova Scotia. He went back to the forests and the hunting trails he had known since childhood. He took up his old work as a guide leading city men into the backcountry for deer and bear. But he was different now. His aim was the same. His hands were the same. The eye that could put a .303 round through a 2-inch circle at 100 meters had not changed. What had changed was the thing behind the eye. The part of a man that connects what he sees in the scope to what he feels in his chest. That connection now ran through Ortona. Every time MacLeod looked through a scope and saw a living thing in the crosshairs, he saw something else. A man crouched over a machine gun, in the ruins of a chapel, reaching for a belt of ammunition, his head and shoulders exposed above the sandbags for just a few seconds. A man who had a family somewhere in Germany. A man whose life MacLeod ended with 3 precisely aimed rounds. It had been clean and necessary, and he would do it again tomorrow if he had to. He knew this about himself, and that knowledge was a stone he carried in his chest every single day. One autumn, not long after the war, MacLeod was guiding a group from Toronto. A bank manager in a brand new hunting jacket, leather boots still shiny, fired at a white-tailed deer from 50 meters and missed. The animal vanished into the trees in a single bound. "Shoot again! Shoot again!" the man yelled, jerking the trigger into empty air. MacLeod watched him. A middle-aged man in expensive clothes shouting because he had missed a deer. And in that moment, McLeod saw everything. He saw soldiers emptying magazines at MG-42 positions and hitting nothing. He saw training manuals that measured success by volume of fire. He saw Captain Sinclair ordering a retreat because the book said retreat. Everyone reacts the same way when they are afraid or frustrated. They do more. They go faster. They get louder. But the answer is almost always the opposite. Less. Slower. Quieter. More precise. The deer is gone, sir. If you want to find another one, you will need to stop shooting and start listening. That was the last season McLeod guided hunters. He became a forestry worker. He spent his days planting trees and managing timberlands. Spruce and pine and maple and oak. His hands, which had been shaped by a lifetime of precise work with weapons, now did precise work with saplings and soil, creating life where there had been none. Nobody who saw him working in the tree lines of rural Nova Scotia would have known that this quiet man in muddy boots had once dismantled a German ambush with 64 bullets. Nobody would have guessed that the forests he tended were in their own way his answer to the war. Every tree he planted was a declaration that he was done with taking life, that he had been good at it, and it had been necessary, and he did not apologize for it, but he was finished. The rest of his years would be spent putting living things into the ground, not putting dead things under it. Tommy Mackey survived the war and went home to his fishing village. He married a girl from the next town over. He had 3 children. He fished for cod and mackerel and lobster the way his father and grandfather had fished, going out before dawn and coming back after the light failed, smelling of salt and diesel and the cold Atlantic. But on December mornings, when the air carried that particular sharpness, Mackey would stop whatever he was doing and stare out at the water with eyes that were not seeing waves. His wife learned the look. She never asked what he was thinking. She did not need to. She knew he was somewhere in Italy, on a street where ribbons hung from broken windows, holding a gun he was not sure he knew how to use until the moment he used it. His children asked about the war once. Just once. Your father went to war and came back, he told them. That is the whole story. They never asked again. But a few times each year, because Nova Scotia is a small place, and veterans find each other the way water finds cracks in stone, Mackey would visit McLeod. The 2 men would sit on a porch or in a kitchen and drink a beer and say almost nothing. An hour might pass with fewer than 10 words spoken between them. It did not matter. They shared a language that had no words in it. The language of men who had fired the same guns and felt the same recoil and heard the same silence when the firing stopped. Robert Foran went back to the coal mines of Cape Breton. He liked to joke that the MG-42s in Ortona were less frightening than the mine shaft. At least in the war, he said, you could see the thing that was trying to kill you. Underground, the danger was invisible. Gas, cave-ins, mechanical failure, a support timber placed at the wrong angle, a gas reading missed by a single digit. One careless moment and men died in the dark. McLeod's philosophy followed Foran underground. Precision over speed. Measure twice. Place the beam exactly where it needs to go. Do not rush. Do not cut corners. The difference between a safe shift and a catastrophe was often a matter of inches, and Foran understood inches the way McLeod understood bullet placement. Both men had learned the same lesson in different classrooms. Every action counts. Make it precise or do not make it at all. The hunter's doctrine became official doctrine. Training manuals across the Commonwealth were rewritten. Soldiers in the 1950s and 1960s and beyond learned to fire automatic weapons in controlled bursts, 3 to 5 rounds, aimed at the target, not sprayed across the landscape in the hope that enough lead would solve the problem. The official name for this approach was aimed automatic fire. Among the veterans who remembered Ortona and the stories that came out of it, the name was simpler: the hunter's doctrine. The Bren gun itself remained in service for nearly 50 years after Ortona. The British modified it, rechambered it, redesignated it as the L4, and kept handing it to soldiers who fought in places that McLeod had never heard of. The Falkland Islands in 1982, Cyprus, Cold War exercises on the plains of northern Germany, the slow gun that the Fallschirmjäger had laughed at in December 1943 was still being carried into combat when McLeod was an old man planting trees in Nova Scotia. When the armies of the world finally retired the Bren and designed new light machine guns to replace it, they did not try to match the MG-42. That lesson had been learned. the American M249, the British L86, the Canadian C9. Every one of them fires between 700 and 850 rounds per minute, faster than the Bren, much slower than the MG42. The weapons designers had found the balance point, the place where a soldier can lay down effective fire without losing the ability to aim. They did not find that balance point in a laboratory. They found it on the battlefields of Italy and Northwest Europe in the winter of 1943, when men like James McLeod proved that the best numbers on paper do not always win the fight in the mud. Sometimes on cold December mornings when the Nova Scotian air carried a sharpness that reminded him of a different December in a different country, James McLeod would stop his work among the trees and stand still. He would hear the sound of the Bren. Tack, tack, tack. That careful, deliberate sound so unlike the scream of the MG42 carrying its quiet promise across the years. Every round is going exactly where I put it. He would feel the trigger under his finger, the gentle squeeze, the slight push of the recoil, the bone-deep certainty that the shot went true. He would see the Christmas ribbons, red and green scraps of a peacetime life, swaying on shattered window frames in the wind of a December that smelled of cordite and brick dust and blood. He would think about David Drummond, who gave him 10 minutes and never came home. About Tommy Mackey hauling lobster traps on the Atlantic, telling his children nothing. About Robert Foran descending into the dark earth every morning with the same precision that once kept him alive in the ruins of Ortona. About the German soldiers who lay on that street. Men with families and futures and names that McLeod would never know. Men who were also human. Then he would pick up his shovel and go back to planting trees. James McLeod died in 1987 at the age of 71. He did not write a book. He did not speak at ceremonies. He did not seek recognition or fame or gratitude. He lived quietly in the province where he was born, tending forests that would outlast him by centuries. And when he was gone, the trees he planted kept growing. The way good ideas keep growing long after the man who had them is buried in the ground. His name does not appear in any training manual. His method does. A military historian tracked McLeod down in the 1970s for a book on Canadian infantry tactics. By then, McLeod was a weathered old forester with sawdust in the lines of his hands and a quietness about him that the historian found almost unsettling. The historian asked him to explain what had happened at Ortona. McLeod thought about it for a long time. Then he said something the historian wrote down and never forgot. They laughed at our slow gun until they realized every round we fired had a name on it. Speed does not matter if you are missing. A slow gun that hits will always beat a fast gun that misses, every single time. The Germans measured killing power by rounds per minute. The Canadians measured it by rounds on target. One side counted its bullets. The other side made its bullets count. That difference matters beyond the battlefield. In every part of life, in every kind of work, in every problem worth solving, we face the same choice between doing more and doing better, between speed and accuracy, between volume and precision, between looking impressive and being effective. We can work longer hours, or we can work on the right things. We can speak louder, or we can say what matters. We can move faster, or we can move in the right direction. We can fill the air with noise and effort and motion, or we can take a breath, aim carefully, and do the one thing that actually needs doing. Speed attracts attention. Power looks good on paper, but precision wins. It wins in war, and it wins in peace, and it wins in every quiet contest between the man who fires 1,000 rounds and the man who fires one and does not miss. Sometimes the answer to a problem does not come from the expert with the best credentials or the loudest voice. Sometimes it comes from a quiet man who learned something in the woods that nobody thought to teach in the classroom. A man who spent his life watching animals and reading patterns and understanding that every living thing, no matter how powerful, has a moment when it is vulnerable. And that the one who waits for that moment and does not waste it is the one who walks away. In war, as in life, effectiveness beats intensity. When precision meets courage, the slow gun that hits will always be better than the fast gun that misses. The careful approach will outlast the hasty one. And mocking another man's tools is the surest way to discover what those tools can do. Every bullet should have a name on it. The distinctive sound of the Bren gun, that slow, deliberate tack, 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 became the sound that German soldiers learned to fear. Not because it was loud, not because it was fast, but because it meant that the man behind it was not missing. It meant that someone had learned the lesson of a quiet hunting guide from Nova Scotia. And it meant that laughing at another man's weapon is the fastest way to be silenced by it.